Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to other people about their stories with VEDS or Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. This is your host, Katie, and before we get into the show, I want to remind you that the views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back to another episode of Staying Connected. I'd like to start this episode with a moment of silence for our friend Otto Nitschmann, who was previously on the show. Otto passed away on April 20th. Otto, I miss you, my friend. I send so much love to your family, your friends, and our community members who loved you too. Let's take a moment. If you'd like to go back and listen to Otto tell his story, I've linked it in the episode show notes. Today, we will talk to Jared Griffin, founder and CEO of Annabelle's Challenge in the UK, which he founded after his daughter's diagnosis of VEDS. In this interview, I mentioned that I run the VEDS Movement. At the time of this interview with Jared, I was the director of the VEDS Movement, but my last day with the Marfan Foundation was in March, and this piece of the interview is no longer accurate. Listen in at the end of the show for some info about community events coming up, including Reds for VEDS Day, which is just around the corner. Before we go over to the interview, if you want to support this show, consider joining my Patreon. For a few dollars a month, you can make sure this show continues to reach people around the world with real-life stories about VEDS. You can join the Patreon at patreon.com/translucent1, and you can also support the show by sharing this podcast with people you know to help us raise awareness of VEDS around the world. Thank you so much for your support, and a huge thanks to my current patrons who have already been supporting the show. My top-tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. Hey, Jared, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and sharing your experience and also talking about Annabelle's Challenge with everybody. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself first off?
Yes, thank you for having me. So I'm Jared Griffin. I'm CEO and founder of Annabelle's Challenge, a UK registered charity for vascular EDS, but I'm also Annabelle's dad.
And we're going to talk about Annabelle's diagnosis with VEDS. But first, if there's somebody listening to this podcast who doesn't really know what VEDS is, how would you describe it to them?
It's a rare life-threatening connective tissue disorder. And unfortunately for patients with this condition, they look perfectly normal on the outside. It's the inside that obviously we can't see, and that's where the problems are. So it affects arteries. They're prone to dissections, ruptures, aneurysms, etc. So that's basically it. It affects the whole body, mainly the vascular system.
When was Annabelle diagnosed with VEDS?
So she was diagnosed in December 2012, which was a week before Christmas. We got that diagnosis, and she was age 3. So from a UK perspective, she was the youngest patient that they'd ever diagnosed. And leading up to that, it was all the easy, unexplained bruising that gave us an indication that something wasn't right with her.
And how can you tell me a little bit more about how did that process go of you notice this easy bruising and all these problems to finally getting that genetic test?
I think we were lucky because we've got 2 older boys that we've not had issues with. We knew something wasn't right with Annabelle because she was displaying these bruises and you couldn't explain them. Some trauma injuries, which look almost bordering on being an abuse issue. So we knew it wasn't right. And initially she got a diagnosis of von Willebrand's disease, which is a blood clotting disorder. And that's the route that we went down and accepted that was it. And we thought that journey was bad enough to go down. But eventually, she was having some blood taken, and the doctor left a handprint on her, and knew that wasn't right. So then that was raising red flags. And eventually, a consultant who had studied EDS in his student years mentioned Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, not a type, just those very words. We're going to take you down that route because we think there's a connective tissue disorder problem. because she had a gash to her head. She felt no pain. It had to be worked on to fix the hole, the gash in the head. And eventually we were copied in on a letter and it mentioned Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, and off we went and Googled it, and wow.
Yeah. Tell me about how that felt to you.
Well, initially back then, so 10 years ago, not pleasant on Google. Life expectancy was lower than what it is today. It was all doom and gloom when you researched it. Initially, the geneticist that we were referred to said, we don't believe she's got vascular EDS, so we're not going to test. But by then, because that had been dropped on us, we said we'd even pay for a genetic test. We need to rule it out. So they reluctantly referred us to the Sheffield clinic, who's the EDS National Diagnostic Service. And even they said, we don't think she's got it, but because you're adamant, we'll do the test. And then it came back as a positive result.
Yeah, and that was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago.
So take me from her being diagnosed to starting Annabelle's Challenge. What kind of inspired you to do this?
I think the inspiration came from the long journey back home. As we were driving, none of us spoke because we were in shock that we'd been given this diagnosis. First reaction from my wife, Sarah, to the consultant was, how long has she got to live? And then at that point, vascular, that must be the worst type. It suddenly dawned on me that we've got a major problem here. But the inspiration behind Annabelle's Challenge was that drive home, not knowing where to turn to next. What consultants do we need to line up? What appointments do we need to book? Do we tell school? Do we tell social services? Who in the family do we tell? Like I said, we've got two older boys. One was a bit too young to probably understand. And that for me was, so you shouldn't go through that. No other family should go through that. At the very least, you should walk away with what's going to happen next. So although Christmas was a write-off for us, I set about to set up a Facebook page for Annabelle to raise awareness of her condition for others. But it very quickly grew from there, where people were reaching out from all over the world saying, I've got this. And a year later, we became a registered charity. So it moved very quickly.
Yeah. And what do you do at Annabelle's Challenge now? I mean, has it been at least 10 years that you've been around, right?
Yeah.
So what did you do at the beginning and what do you do now?
The three core values that we put in from day one are still here today. So 10 years on, we've never deviated away from our three core objectives, which is education, research, and support. Research we put on the back burner because we knew that's a lot of money, millions, long term. So we focused on the education, which was around raising awareness amongst the public and medical professionals. But the biggest part of what we do is support. So supporting families, individuals. When somebody joins us with this diagnosis, whilst we want to look after that particular person, we understand it affects the rest of the family and loved ones. So we take them in as one unit. So one member to us is probably four people when you think about the immediate family.
Yeah. And how many people now do you have is the word registered or members of your organization?
So on the database, we've got 380 members. But when you then split that out into actual individuals that are diagnosed, because it might be one individual in the family like Annabelle, or it could be a family who's got four individuals that are affected, it's about 480 now across 22 countries.
Wow, that is impressive.
Yeah, predominantly the UK, and a big chunk of America sits behind it, and behind that is Australia and then the European countries, but they're quite small in terms of numbers.
Yeah, and you, like, most of your support that you do is really based in the UK and Australia, right?
Yes, because we're blessed in the UK that we've got two clinics, one based in Sheffield, one based in London, that are part of what they call a highly specialised service from the NHS. And being highly specialised, it's funded. It's never going to go away because we've got, between the two sites, 400 patients now. The service has been going since 2009. Its full title is the Ehlers-Danlos National Diagnostic Service, but EDS service to us.
That is so wonderful that you've built all of this. And and that how that was kind of like came about from that kind of devastating moment, and it seems familiar because that's like how I ended up starting like all of my awareness stuff too, was like, oh, this was so terrible. I don't want anybody else to go through this, right?
Yeah, and because first thing people do is go on the internet, and it's even 10 years on, it's still not great. You still come across the not nice, negative stories. The way we position it when somebody reaches out that's either suspected that they've got the condition or they've confirmed they've got it, it's all about the support and looking forward and putting things in place. And we take Zoom calls now, and you get some people come on and they're in tears, but by the end of the call, we have them coming off it with a smile on the face, because it's not all doom and gloom. It's just a diagnosis that you've got to work around.
Yeah. Yeah, it completely is. And my understanding of that has shifted too since my own diagnosis. And it was definitely like that when I was diagnosed. It was this like, oh, I remember sitting on my living room floor thinking like, I'm gonna die so soon.
Mm.
And there's nothing to do about it. It just felt terrible. And now I know, like years later, that there are things to do, and there are things that you can like help, like there are things that you can do that can help you be prepared for emergencies, and get a good medical team together, and like all sorts of things that I really didn't even think about when I was first diagnosed, and just processing this really terrible information. And I know that, like the VEDS movement, you also have an emergency preparedness kit and everything. Why don't you tell people about that?
Yeah, I think between us both, on both sides of the Atlantic, it's the same diagnosis, it's the same problems. The healthcare systems are slightly different, but ultimately the way you manage it is exactly the same wherever you are. So it is about preparedness. We always advocate to set up an emergency preparedness pack. We do understand that some people that are affected don't want to deal with that, because it's like, I just don't want to face it. But when you get a chance to face it, it's well worth having, so that in the event of an emergency, and it doesn't have to be vascular EDS related, they are quite rare, having an incident with vascular EDS. It can tend to be more like an accident in the playground that causes trauma, but the vascular EDS could then be a problem.
Right.
So when we talk about people going to the emergency room, it's not necessarily the VEDS that's taking them there. It could be that they've just had an accident and they have to be treated like glass, fragile. So from a consultant's point of view, it's all about making them prepared that if you go in as a normal surgeon, you're great at your job, but these guys are very fragile and you could cause a problem when you're trying to fix it. So part of the preparedness kit is details about how to call an ambulance, what you do when you arrive at hospital, having an emergency sheet with all the information on to give to a medical professional. If it's a loved one that's going with you, having them to advocate for you if need be, or advocating for yourself, because the doctors will not know about vascular EDS. Very rare that they do. Some you'll come across will say, yeah, I've heard of EDS, but they're focusing on the wrong type.
Right.
And then you've got the kick in, no, it's the vascular type. But it's having the documents to hand to give to them, medical alert bracelets.
Yeah.
And that's what we help patients with and families.
So do you have a couple of those materials available that you could show on video?
Yeah, so we during lockdown, because we were all told to stay at home, it gave us time to prepare the pack. So we everybody that joins us now with a confirmed diagnosis, they get sent a welcome pack, if you can call it a welcome pack, an information pack. And in there is details about who we are and what we do. We enclose the emergency sheet with what to give it to a consultant. It explains what not to do in the emergency room. The emergency blue wallet card, which is provided by the NHS clinics in Sheffield and London, which is basically the A4 sheet on a small card. But what we do is when we send that pack out to somebody, we then follow it up with a phone call or a Zoom to explain the pack, and that we'll do things over a period of time and not all at once, because we know firsthand the early stages of the diagnosis is quite stressful and the anxiety levels are up there, which we understand. I've been there, I know what it feels like. So we break it down where over a period of weeks, let's tackle different parts of the pack.
I love that. That's awesome. And I know that, so the NHS is that's like UK specific, right?
Yes.
So for those listening, there's a similar pack available for those in the US, and that's through the VEDS movement. This podcast is not associated with the VEDS movement, but in full transparency, I run the VEDS movement, so it would be weird of me if I did not mention that exists for people outside of the UK and outside of that NHS system. But I think the important takeaway is that if you have VEDS, there are resources kind of specific to where you are, especially in the UK with Annabelle's Challenge.
Yeah, and on top of that, we've now converted the emergency sheet, translated into 7 different languages. So when the guys out here in the UK travel to Europe, we've got at least seven translations of the document now to help out.
I love that so much. That is so awesome. So that's a big achievement from Annabelle's Challenge for sure. And I know that you've had a lot of great achievements there. And it's just an organization that continues to grow and do wonderful things for people with VEDS. As the CEO founder, what do you feel like is your biggest achievement?
I think along the journey, the biggest achievement was getting the support of the community behind us. That's made a massive change. I know we support people with the condition, but likewise they support us. We actually get calls coming into the office checking up on us. We just this catch-up call to see how you are, and I'm like, we were supposed to ring you. But along the way, those numbers have grown, and the volunteers have got us into a position where in 2018 we received the Queen's Award for voluntary service, which is big. Yeah. It's huge, to get the Queen's Award. And that was a reflection of the hard work from our community in terms of supporting us around the country, and where we are today, we're still totally focused on support. So, and I think another big achievement is to have the 2 clinics on side with us. So we've got that 360-degree approach to looking after somebody with this condition. We managed to host the world's first VEDS conference in 2017 in conjunction with EDS Support UK and the EDS service. And later on we did a retreat weekend. So we're always thinking what we can do for the community, because what is very valuable to them is when they can meet others with the condition, whether it's a phone call, Zoom, conference, retreat weekend. They love meeting others because you don't have to explain yourself. We all get it. And it's lovely to bring families together. That's what I enjoy the most with it.
Yeah, I think that's also one of my favorite things about, being part of this community is getting to talk with others who are affected. And I know you've done a great job at Annabelle's Challenge, and huge congrats on that Queen's Award. That's amazing. That is I'm from the US, so I don't really, we don't have a queen, but I think about how special that is, and it just seems like a really great achievement to get that kind of recognition.
Yeah, it's just the icing on the cake where you're recognised as an organisation for the work that we do for this rare disease community, with very small numbers as well. You've got some organisations that are dealing with thousands of people with a condition, where we're not. We are globally very small. But I think it's because we're so connected to the community, and it's a wonderful community to work with. We know how difficult this condition is in terms of the risk of something happening, but when you deal with the families, the resilience is amazing, and that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, completely. I love that. So you talked about your pillars being support, education, and research, I believe, right? So where, you have these emergency preparedness resources, you have the clinics associated with you, you've got support groups and all sorts of things available to people. What's next? What are your big goals that you're working on now for people with VEDS?
Short term, we did start to look at research. So we funded our very first research project jointly with EDS Support UK with our London clinic. That happened a couple of years ago. So that was our first funded piece of research. And since then, we've helped student genetic counsellors who have done some research projects with the VEDS community. and there's more to come. So I think that low hanging fruit of trying to help people day to day living with a condition, that's what we like getting involved with. But the ultimate goal is one day, hopefully, we find a fix for it. So working with pharmaceutical companies to, come up with a fix for this condition. So, and that started to happen. There's a couple of clinical trials, one that's now gone live to look at celiprolol and the effectiveness of it. So there is good news on the horizon. I think that's what we've got to be hopeful for, that we attract more pharma companies to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great goal too, because I mean, how wonderful would it be one day to not have to worry about those major life-threatening things, right?
Yeah.
Like I would love, like the biggest challenge that I would have would be like, oh, my skin tore again and I'm going to go get stitches. Like what? I mean, it seems like a pipe dream, but it seems like a wonderful dream to be working towards with research, is just this not having those artery dissections and crazy, scary things just kind of hanging over your head.
Yeah. And coupled with, if we're working on the day-to-day management as well and minimizing risks, coupled with some drugs that might work a little bit as well,
Yeah.
we're in a better, stronger position than we were probably 5 years ago when we had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hopeful for our community and obviously my daughter Annabelle that we get somewhere sooner rather than later, whereas probably 5 years ago I would have said this is absolutely, it's probably not even in my lifetime. But here we are, we're talking to pharmaceutical companies now that are looking at trials. So
yeah,
science is moving on at pace and genetics is moving on at pace. So it's much better than it was 10 years ago, let's put it that way, when we was given that diagnosis and our world fell apart, I'll be honest with you. And I know when we get these calls, when they come in on Zoom or physically on the telephone, we know where their anxiety is. I've been there, I know what it feels like. It's our job now to bring that down, and it's not all bad. At least you know what's potentially the problem because we now have got that diagnosis.
yeah. And I do really think that there's a lot of power in that. Like there's a lot of power in the knowledge that you like are prone to these kinds of things. Because I think about, before I was diagnosed, I was living with an artery dissection for a year and a half and had tons of pain. And when I went to the ER, like nobody thought to look at my arteries, right? But now that I know I have VEDS, like I know what that pain feels like. And I also know that I need to tell the emergency room that, I'm prone to artery dissections and that I have one, because if I experience that again, like I know I would push for a scan and get diagnosed hopefully much quicker. And I also have lifestyle changes that I can make where I'm not like benching my body weight or something like that. Like there are things that you can do and it's not completely hopeless.
No, I think it's all about having a good care team, particularly a cardiologist. We was always thinking, we've got to have a vascular surgeon on board. Yes, that's great. But the cardiologist is the one that will probably do your annual scanning, pick up if there's a problem, no knee-jerk reaction because we can just keep monitoring that and to see if there's any movement. And only recently a patient said, my aneurysm's grown. And when he mentioned what it was, I was, oof, that's not good. And he dead calmly said, no, cardiologist says, if it gets any worse, we'll just go in and fix it. And I thought, a few years ago, you wouldn't have that conversation. It'd be, no, we can't do anything. And so there is hope that we can manage it much better than we used to do. And we've got to not focus on this average age, because we've got people in our database that are in the 60s, 70s. They're active with us. Sadly, we lose some young ones, we lose some older ones, but it's not. Please, if you ever come across this diagnosis and you're doing your research, forget that average age of 51, because I can tell you now we've got a lot of people beyond that age that are still with us, still having an active life.
That's great advice. I want you to give advice for people who are newly diagnosed. But before, I want to jump back to something that you said here, and that's the change in the way that the doctors even talk about it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the awareness that you've built, that, some other organizations have built. The VEDS Collaborative, I think, had a big part in this over the last few years. But there is a shift in how a lot of doctors think about this condition. I know even when I was diagnosed in 2017, it was, if you have this, like, you're never going to be operated on. A vascular surgeon told me before I met the expert that, like I will likely never operate on you because you're a vascular surgeon's worst nightmare. And a lot of the surgery talk was about avoiding surgery at all costs and how just absolutely bad, and they will never operate unless it's absolutely life threatening. And I had one neurosurgeon that was like, yeah, even if it's life, like I'm just not even going to try. And how that was so devastating. But there is a shift now, and more doctors are learning about it. They're getting education through places like the Ehlers-Danlos Society and the VEDS Movement and Annabelle's Challenge. And, Shireen Shalhoub has done a lot of awareness. Like a lot of the awareness among the medical community is growing. And that seems to have resulted in this shift where you can actually talk to a doctor and they'll say, okay, this isn't an emergency right now, but if it becomes one, they have tools and resources to be able to do that surgery with the confidence of a very cautious, mindset in some ways. Like they know going in, but they're not afraid of it.
Yeah, I think the good news today is a lot of consultants are now collaborating and talking to each other. So within the medical professionals, they are reaching out to each other, especially the ones that are have probably worked on more people with vascular EDS, so they've got more knowledge versus a surgeon that's probably never operated on somebody before with vascular EDS. So those conversations are starting to be had, and I think they are listening to what the patients are saying as well. And we always say, try not to operate on somebody with vascular EDS, but the conversations now are more actually, let's go in and attempt to repair now, because we've got extra things on standby. So we always tell a patient, have you got a vascular surgeon on standby, a plastic surgeon, extra bloods on standby? Has the anaesthetist been prepped? Because that can be problematic. And as long as you've got the entire medical team fully prepared, it's going to be a better outcome. Because when we look back at some sad cases, some of those, they weren't aware that they had vascular EDS.
Right.
And in some pregnancies, they weren't aware that the person had vascular EDS. Could those people, some of them, might have been a different outcome. So it is all about the awareness and education, and the more we can do that globally so that the medical community understand the complications of vascular EDS when you work on somebody versus having that knowledge.
Yeah, and it seems like on both sides, it's about being prepared, both for people who have the diagnosis and can do things to prepare, like, get a care team and their emergency kits and all of that. But it's also preparedness on the medical professional side, finding good information about VEDS, consulting with another doctor who knows more about it than you do. If you're a surgeon, like having these things like you talk about on standby in case you do have to operate with somebody with VEDS, you have the best chance at giving them the best outcome. And so it kind of feels like preparedness on both sides.
Yeah, and it's even going beyond that to look at where your local hospital is, because your nearest emergency room might not be the best equipped. And there could be one that's another 15-minute drive away for the ambulance that has got the right tools to do the job. So unfortunately, from a patient and family's perspective, you've got to go out and do that homework and make sure, we do have some people reaching out, I'm going to move to a different area just because
so
of
stressful.
the factory equipped. And I get that, but it is about preparedness.
Yeah, it totally is.
And not just for yourself as somebody with it as a patient, but also your loved ones and the carers. They need to be fully prepared. If it's a child in school, the school needs to be prepared, and that's one of the things that we help with as well from a support point of view.
That's so wonderful. So what, we're talking about preparedness and all of these awesome tools. Is that what you would tell somebody who's newly diagnosed, or what kind of advice would you give somebody listening to this who's just kind of struggling with that?
Well, we've just launched last week a page on the website for newly diagnosed or recently diagnosed, because we think we know with those people, because having been there and done it as a newly diagnosed person for Annabelle, because your anxiety levels are quite high at that moment in time, you'll miss things because you're just trying to get your head around the condition to start with, let alone doing research on what do we need to put in place. And that's where we reach out with the pack, and we actually say on the phone call, let's do it over time so that you as a family can get your head around the diagnosis, but we'll help you with the technical side of it, like setting up an ambulance marker. If it's a child, we'll go to the school and do a talk to the teachers so that you don't have to, because we wouldn't expect a parent to stand up and talk about vascular EDS.
Right.
It'd be so raw because your child's got it, and are you confident enough anyway to give a talk in the school? So we take that pressure away, and whether that's a physical visit to school or done via Zoom. And I think for us, it's always when anybody ever rings or comes into contact with us, I instantly go back 10 years. What did it feel like for us on that journey? And that's how we deal with people, because I genuinely want to try and reduce that stress.
Yeah.
And actually focus on living your life. So we will be the bomb disposal experts, and we'll deal with all that side of it. And you as a family and an individual, focus on having a good life. Do go on your holidays and your vacations, and because 10 years ago we were told we couldn't fly, but yet in a couple of months' time we're going to go long haul to Australia because you can fly.
It's awesome.
10 years ago you were told you can't get pregnant. Today, whilst it's still a race, put things in place. A lot of the babies are coming through safe and sound. So things have changed massively over 10 years, but I never forget what it's like on day one when you hit with the diagnosis. And also the people that are suspected of having vascular EDS, that is probably the worst phase, because it's the not knowing until you get your results back. And when I look back, it was that for anybody now, and it can be up to a year now to get a genetic test result over here because of the sheer volume of genetic testing that's going on, because awareness has got better. So on one side, it's brilliant from an awareness point of view. The flip side is there's more testing getting done, so there's going to be a delay in getting your results. And for 12 months, we've got to still look after these people. Great news if it comes back negative, but let's prepare ourselves if it is positive. Let's start to put things in place. Not officially, because I can't do that until you're confirmed, but we know that is a very,
very high stress
period of time.
So high
not
stress.
Knowing.
Yes. And, if you're a medical student out there listening to this podcast, genetics, go into genetics. Like we need more geneticists, I think, so that there isn't this 12-month, year and a half wait for people to get in. It is from experience myself, that was the most stressful time for me. It was just that period of even trying to get in to see a geneticist and thinking that you have this condition and just not having much support at all. I mean, you're just like waiting, wondering. And it's great that we have these resources now where once you're diagnosed, like you're in, right? Like you've got wonderful support systems with Annabelle's Challenge and other organizations. But until that moment, it's really hard. It's really hard. And, if you're listening to this and you want to go into genetics, there's a shortage, I think, and it would be a great place to be helping people.
Yeah. And I think if you're a consultant and you suspect it possibly could be vascular EDS, please put them through for genetic testing, because that is just a simple, it'll rule it out, yes or no.
Yeah.
It's accurate. We know what we're dealing with. And now, certainly from the UK perspective, the panel tests for 47 EDS genes and other things. So it's not just COL3A1, which is the gene that's effective for vascular EDS. They'll look at the other types. And if it's a rarer type, they will then be looked after by the EDS service.
It's wonderful.
If it's a vascular type, they're going to get looked after not only by the EDS service, but us as Annabelle's Challenge. They can reach out to the VEDS Movement. There's all that support kicks in, and that's what we want to do with these families and individuals. As soon as it comes back positive, we're all over it.
Yeah. Well, you have done a wonderful job, Jared.
It keeps us busy.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your experience and, for doing everything that you do with Annabelle's Challenge. It's so important.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jared, for everything you do for our community and for coming on the show. And thank you, everybody, for listening today. Did you know that Reds for VEDS Day is less than 2 weeks away? It's on May 19th, And I'm so excited to see everybody participating using the hashtag and wearing red and sharing their pictures on social media of them wearing red. So if you want to participate, we do this every year, and we raise awareness by wearing red and taking a picture and sharing it on social media by using the hashtag REDS4VEDS. Again, that is REDS4VEDS. So be sure to wear red on May 19th and to share your picture on social media. And later today, on May 6th, Bella Marin, known as the Investigator on social media, and myself will be on a YouTube live stream for a talk about our lives with VEDS. This is at 10 a.m. Pacific time, so if you're hearing this early in the morning, you don't have much time to get to us, but we will be there at 10 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Central Time, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty about what it is like living with VEDS, and we'll answer questions too. There are additional opportunities to connect with others and learn more about VEDS coming up soon as well. The Marfan Foundation hosts in-person walks for victory around the United States. These are fundraisers, but they're also an opportunity to connect with others in the community. In May and June, join community members at these events in Aptos, California, Seattle, Washington, New York City, New York, Boston, New England, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. And coming up right around the corner is the Foundation's Conference, held this year in Chicago, July 13th to 16th. I think there's a good number of people that are signed up to go to that from our VEDS community. And in addition to that, the Ehlers-Danlos Society is hosting a VEDS Camp in partnership with the VEDS Movement the weekend prior to this at Camp Joy in Ohio. So I believe that is July 7th to 9th. Between these two events, you should have an opportunity to meet others with VEDS, meet the experts, and get all sorts of questions answered. Links to more information about these events can be found in the episode show notes. There will be a special episode of Staying Connected coming up this next weekend on May 13th, featuring Chris Schelling, CEO of Acer Therapeutics, and Dr. Adrian Cortell, Chief Medical Officer of Acer, about the Discover trial for Adzevo, or celiprolol, a clinical trial currently enrolling in the United States for people with VEDS. This might be released in a 2-part episode. Truly, I haven't decided yet, but the entire interview will be available on May 13th. Don't forget to subscribe to Staying Connected on your podcast player so you don't miss this or any other future episodes. And if you like this show, I hope you will consider sharing it with your friends on social media to help us raise awareness of VEDS together. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon at patreon.com/translucent1. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.